I'm Matt McClure.
And I'm Francesca Maxime, and this is Currents.
The wait is over. The Pope releases a major letter to the world. We'll have analysis of his new encyclical.
A dance, a procession, preparing for a big celebration in Williamsburg.
It's meant to be a lot of the devotions, not only that are so important to the Italian people, but that are important to the people of Brooklyn.
And a priest with two callings.
I think when I was a kid, there were two things I wanted to do in life. I wanted to be either a cop or a priest.
Good evening. After months of delay, Pope Benedict today released his third encyclical, Caritas In Veritate, or Charity in Truth. An encyclical is a letter from the Pope on a topic he considers of great importance. And certainly the topic in this one is a subject on everyone's mind, the global economy.
For sure. The Pope says that profit should not be the goal of economic systems, but instead just a means to an end. Benedict also touches on other topics, including the environment, the United Nations, and life issues. For some analysis, our Nathalia Ortiz visited with David Gibson. Now, he's a well-known author on religion and also a journalist who happens to live right here in Brooklyn. Gibson most recently wrote The Rule of Benedict. It's a close-up look at the current Pope from the time he was known as Cardinal Ratzinger.
So for those viewers who are not familiar with the encyclical, explain to us all what that really is and what does Caritas in Veritatis mean?
Caritas in Veritatis is the Latin name. Everything in the church is, of course, originally in Latin, and it just means charity in love, or charity in truth, rather, or love in truth. The word can be translated either way. And it's an encyclical focused on the social justice teachings of the Church in light of the context of the global financial and economic situation. An encyclical letter, it comes from the word simply meaning a circular letter, almost from the time of the apostles, when letters of St. Paul were circulated around to the various local churches. And that's what this is. This is a letter from the successor of Peter, that's designed for the entire church. But also, interestingly, it's addressed to all men and women of goodwill. So it's really a letter not just for the church, but for the entire world.
What are the particular points that stick out in this document to you?
Well, I think the Pope is, Benedict XVI, is really not known so much as a proponent of social justice teaching. He's a theologian and very much a scholar. John Paul II and Pope Paul VI before him were known as popes who were really strong in terms of economic justice and social justice and combating social sin, as we call it. The gaps between rich and poor and those kinds of things. Benedict was not expected to be someone who would champion these things, because that's simply not his expertise, and he knows that. But, he's traveled around as Pope for a few years now. He's seen this terrible poverty around the world, and he wanted to do something and to say something in light of this global economic meltdown. So what he's really doing is he's putting out the church teaching there, but he's also making some very strong recommendations, telling the wealthy nations that they have to increase aid for the poor nations, telling us that we have to have international structures that can really enforce a more just economic system. He's telling us that we need to put this love, this divine love, put, in his phrase, some teeth on it, so that we have a more just economic situation throughout the world.
How do you think this document is going to affect everyday people in their day-to-day lives? Are they really going to feel an impact or be affected by this?
I think that's the big question.
Yeah.
Always. This is an encyclical. It's 30,000 words.
Exactly.
And very dense. I mean, there's some great sound bites in it, but it is what it is. And again, Benedict is a brilliant man, a scholar, and a theologian, and he writes like one. But I think really it's kind of a trickle-down effect with these things, in the sense that the larger message will get out. But it's also, I think, as important as anything is the timing. He wanted to bring this out a year ago, on the 40th anniversary of Paul VI's great social encyclical. But he waited a year because of this fast-changing economic situation that we're facing, to take into account all of the new economic realities and the sources that caused this meltdown, and he did in this document. So in a sense, it really hits at a right time, if you could say. People have ears to hear, if you want to put it that way. World leaders as well are meeting in Italy this week at the G8 Economic Summit, and President Obama himself is going to meet with the Pope for the first time in the Vatican on Friday. So you have this confluence of various events that are coming together. So I think there's a better opportunity than ever for the world audience to hear this message, and for world leaders perhaps to put into practice or policy or legislation some of the recommendations.
Speaking of world leaders, how do you think this document might affect his conversations with President Obama this week?
Well, it's very interesting in the sense that I think the Pope and the President will have much in sync with some of the recommendations that the Pope has put in here, and also the spiritual framework, which we can't lose sight of. I mean, that's one thing that Benedict makes a great point of course, is that this love, this charity that he's talking about comes out of our belief and our belief in Christ. And that's something I think that he and the President also share. But Benedict also, interestingly, and I think more forcefully than in other social justice encyclicals, makes the link between the pro-life agenda and pro-development agenda and the economic agenda. And that's going to be something of a challenge to President Obama, and that could be an interesting discussion when they meet in the Vatican.
Compared to other encyclicals, where does this fit in?
Really, I think it's a tribute to past encyclicals. In a sense, it's a real tribute to John Paul II. It's a real tribute to Pope Paul VI. He cites so much those two other popes and their encyclicals that I think it's really a tribute to them.
You mentioned this encyclical is somewhat of a tribute to past popes and may have cited other encyclicals. What is particularly unique about this one?
Well, he really, again, stitching together the pro-life and social justice messages is so important, but also I think his call for greater financial regulation at a time when we've had this world financial meltdown, at a time when we're a globalized economy in a way we never have been before.
Thank you so much for being with us, David.
Thank you.
Author and journalist David Gibson there. And for more information on the Pope's encyclical, you can head on over to our blog. Just go to netny.net/currents and click on the Riding the Wave logo. We'll let you know where you can go to read the encyclical for yourself. Well, stay tuned. More Currents straight ahead, including the day's headlines.
And it's more than 100 years old, and the people of Williamsburg are keeping it alive.
The feast itself is multifaceted. It's dedicated to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, to St. Paulinus, so that there's many different aspects to it.
Welcome back to Currents. I'm Matt McClure.
And I'm Francesca Maxime. Coming up later, the police serve the public, but who serves them? We'll meet one man who does. But first, let's take a look at today's headlines. Yesterday, we told you about a church bombing in the Philippines, and now, a bit closer to home, officials at St. Edith Stein Church in Brockton, Massachusetts, showed up for Sunday Mass to discover 2 makeshift bombs. The Molotov cocktails had been tossed into an open window, possibly the night before. There was no serious damage and nobody was injured. A little further away from home, Creighton University is establishing the first Catholic medical school west of the Rocky Mountains. Creighton has announced an affiliation with St. Joseph's Hospital and Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona. In a news release, the school says the partnership will allow it to recruit more students.
From St. Joseph to St. Paul, as we hear from Rome Reports, the Vatican ended the last Jubilee year with an historic display.
The Vatican museums have also closed the year of St. Paul in a very special way. They've inaugurated a beautiful exhibition called St. Paul in the Vatican. The highlight of this exhibition is the 4 sarcophagi that speak of history and religion. Its reliefs reveal the earliest depictions of St. Paul by early Christians.
They are important because they were found in the area of St. Paul, exactly below the main altar. They have marks on the sides because they fit beneath the altar where there is the apostles' tomb.
The exhibition shows the different representations that have been made of St. Paul. Initially, he was represented as a philosopher and with an appearance similar to Peter.
Saint Paul is considered the first apostle who made the first theoretical vision of Christianity. That was his mission, and that was how he spent his time, proclaiming the message. He is a very special figure, and that's why they thought of him as a philosopher. He is represented as a bald man with a pointed beard and strong bone features.
In other representations of St. Paul found in the catacombs, he was shown with books. However, in this sarcophagus, he is shown next to a soldier who is unsheathing his sword.
Initially, St. Peter and St. Paul were represented in a very similar way, but later on they started to be depicted differently. Peter with short hair and full beard, and St. Paul almost bald, a pointed beard, or sometimes only around the mouth.
St. Paul's exhibition includes many works of art, like the first translations of St. Paul's texts, read over the centuries by millions of Christians.
Well, just before the year of St. Paul came to an end, we began the year for priests. And while dioceses are facing a shortage of priests, so is the Air Force. So much so that they're sweetening the pot to get recruits. They're offering a scholarship program that will cover seminary tuition fees, books, and a monthly stipend. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald McManus, himself a chaplain, tells the Montgomery Advisor that while 25% of Air Force members are Catholic, only 14% of the chaplains are.
Interesting. Well, stay tuned. There's much more current straight ahead.
It wouldn't be July in Brooklyn without the Giglio.
We certainly have the culture of the diocese and the culture of Brooklyn very well represented throughout the feast.
It's almost here, just a day away as a matter of fact. It is the Feast of the Giglio.
That's right, and it is a celebration that practically takes over the streets of Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And earlier on in the week, I was able to sit down and speak with a couple of men involved in the planning of that 12-day festival. And joining us now to talk about the Feast of the Giglio, we have Dr. Philip Franco and Monsignor Joseph Calise from Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Well, for those who might not be familiar, now I know that this is a tradition, the Feast of the Giglio, that goes back for centuries. But for those who might not be familiar with it, Dr. Franco, we'll start with you. What is the Feast of the Giglio?
Well, the Feast of the Giglio has its roots really in the 5th century in a small southern city called Nola, which is close to Naples. St. Paulinus, or Paulino as we say in Italian, was the bishop of the town, and at one point in the 5th century it was invaded by Mediterranean conquerors, and they took the young people of the town into slavery. Now Paulinus, who was eventually canonized and quite the virtuous bishop of the town, offered himself in place of a widow's only son. And so he went into captivity for a time and was with the children of the town and was a slave himself, really. He gave his life. There was a Turkish sultan, as the legend, as the story goes, who heard about this and Paulinus' heroic virtue, and he was so impressed by that that he rescued him and the young children and brought them back to the town on his boat. And the people were so overjoyed to have the return of their bishop and their children that they built towers of lilies. The word Giglio means lily in Italian, and and it's a symbol of purity. So they built these towers of lilies in his honor, and they carry them in his honor each year after that. And so what is reenacted in the feast, in our particular feast in Brooklyn, is particularly that return of Paulinus. And so the men of the parish carry a tremendous boat, as well as a Giglio, which is really, it's something you have to really behold to appreciate. Yeah. It's like an 80-foot tower, which weighs over 2 tons. And it's carried in his honor, and they reenact the moment in which the boat with Paulinus and the children returned to the town and was greeted by the Giglio.
Now, how far back does this tradition go locally here in Brooklyn?
Well, in Brooklyn, the parish of Our Lady of Mount Carmel was founded in 1887, and really there's been some form of feast ever since then. So this would be the 122nd annual. However, we didn't actually have a Giglio of our own. A lot of the Nolani, people from Nola, came over to Williamsburg, Brooklyn. We didn't actually have a Giglio of our own until 1903, so it's been about 106 years for that part of it.
Okay. Well, the Feast of the Giglio is, I guess, comprised of many things. There's I guess, the main part of the celebration is, do we call that the Feast of the Giglio, the actual, going down the street with, carrying the Giglio? Is that the Feast of the Giglio, or is that the Dance of the Giglio?
That, in particular, that you're referring to is the Dance of the Giglio, which takes place 3 times actually during the feast.
Gotcha.
But the feast itself is multifaceted. It's dedicated to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, to St. Paulinus, so that there's many different aspects to it.
Very good. And Monsignor, tell us a little bit about that. What are maybe some of the other aspects of the feast?
Well, the feast preeminently is a spiritual occasion. It's meant to be a lot of the devotions, not only that are so important to the Italian people, but that are important to the people of Brooklyn. This feast has been a hallmark of both. We begin Wednesday night with an opening mass that's followed by a candlelight procession, and then the statue of Our Lady of Mount Carmel will be placed in the shrine, where it will remain for the 12 days of the feast. There'll be 2 masses on the feast day in particular that will be followed by processions throughout the neighborhood with the statue and the distribution of scapulars. On Giglio Sunday, on the 12th, the 10 o'clock Mass, or the 11 o'clock Mass will be a little bit more joy-filled. It'll be packed. And as a matter of fact, I've invited Monsignor Bob Romano, whose family is from Nola, to be the guest homilist that day. That'll be followed by the Dance of the Giglio. There's the 9-day novena in honor of Our Lady of Mount Carmel and St. Paulinus. So there is a very spiritual nature to the feast. There are religious services that go throughout the days. As a matter of fact, on the feast day itself, Masses will be offered in English, Italian, Spanish, Creole, and Polish. So we certainly have the culture of the diocese and the culture of Brooklyn very well represented throughout the feast. And in addition to that, there's a lot of Italian food. There are a lot of booths. There's games. There's a bazaar. There's a flea market. There'll be an art show that'll be featuring some of the local artists, especially some of the local senior artists. So there's something there for everyone. And we're just really hoping that a lot of people from the diocese will come and learn a little bit about what the feast is all about and come and give us some of their support.
Yeah. Well, very good. And so it's really a multicultural thing, not just, although it has its roots in Italian culture, it is very multicultural now.
It's very Brooklyn.
Gotcha. Very good. See, that's very multicultural, very Brooklyn. The 2 are synonymous. So tell me a little bit about, I understand from doing a little bit of research into this, who are the feast dignitaries? Does that have some sort of root in tradition as well as to who is chosen as a dignitary for the feast?
Absolutely, yeah. The each individual lift, because of the tremendous size and weight of the Giglio, it's impossible for the procession to be ongoing. So it's broken up into about 25 individual lifts. And each lift is conducted by what's called a capo, now, which means leader or head in Italian. Gotcha. And a person who reaches that honor of becoming a capo really has to work his way up for many years, involvement in the parish, involvement in the feast. They usually begin as a lifter, and then they become what's called a lieutenant, who's in charge of a crew of about 40 lifters themselves. And over the years, they work their way up to become a capo, and eventually the #1 capo, the man who's in charge of all lifts during the day.
Gotcha.
And it's a tremendous honor locally for the people, for themselves, and it's something that a man will wait for many years. Yeah. In other words, you don't rise up to become a capo overnight. Yeah. The gentleman, for example, this year, Pat Grandy, who will be the #1 capo, this is something that he has been involved and waiting for well over 30 or 40 years, and involved as a lifter and then making his way up the line.
Gotcha. Well, very good. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being here today. We really appreciate it. We'll have more information about the feast up on our website, and we'll send folks that way, and we'll send folks over to your way as well. We hope that it's a great success.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Monsignor Joseph Calise and Dr. Philip Franco, both of Our Lady of Mount Carmel Parish in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. You can also read more about the Feast of the Giglio on our blog. Just head on over to netny.net/currents, and you can click on the Riding the Wave blog there. Well, stay tuned. Much more currents straight ahead.
Coming up, meet the priest who wanted to be a cop.
He said, "I'd like you to be a chaplain." And I said, "Why me?" And he says, "I see that you talk to cops and they talk to you."
Well, finally, we heard in our interview on the Feast of the Giglio about Monsignor Robert Romano.
He'll give the homily at one of the masses on Giglio Sunday, and we featured him on our show before. And again, tonight, Monsignor Romano is our eyewitness.
I'm Monsignor Robert Romano. I'm the Deputy Chief Chaplain of the New York City Police Department. I've been with the police department since 1998, and currently I'm also the pastor of Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish in Brooklyn since June of 2008. I think when I was a kid, there were two things I wanted to do in life. I wanted to be either a cop or a priest. You know, I made the decision to become a priest, and then got involved with working with police officers who were injured in the line of duty. And then never thought that I would be made a department chaplain. And just one day I received a phone call from the commissioner, and it was at that time it was Commissioner Safer, and he said, "I'd like you to come in, I want to talk to you about something." I was mesmerized. I didn't know what he wanted to talk to me about. And when I got into his office, he said, "I'd like you to be a chaplain." And I said, "Why me?" And he says, "I see that you talk to cops and they talk to you." I guess I felt really challenged in my faith when 9/11 happened. I questioned, how come? And I also realized too that the loss of so many people in my life that were important to me that day. A godson, a classmate, altar servers that I had in previous parishes. In fact, one of them, I baptized his baby on September the 1st, and 10 days later he was killed. A lot of people would say, yeah, where was God? How did he allow this to happen? My response is that God was there. He was there in the men and the women who ran into the building that day and who single-handedly saved almost 20,000 people.
As we come together this morning to celebrate.
Why do I do it? I do it because I'm a priest. And as a priest, my role is to be available for people. Now, I guess most priests do it in a parish. I have two jobs. I do it in a parish, and I do it for a larger parish of the NYPD. I do it because I think it's important. I do it because I enjoy it. And I do it because, again, I come always down to, I'm a priest.
Monsignor Robert Romano, he's tonight's eyewitness.
It's amazing that there were two things that he wanted to be in his life, either a priest or a policeman, right. And he got to do both.
I know, and I've often said, like, my mother, she wanted to be a nun or she wanted to be a physician, and she was a physician, but she does a lot of missionary work now, too. So it's nice when you can combine your two real loves.
Right. I was going to say the nun thing apparently didn't work out.
Well, no. Hence, I am here. But that's
right.
Okay. You know, what could you do without me? But anyway, it's that whole Feast of the Giglio, too, is great because that is such a heavy thing. I mean, such an honor to bear, but also such a heavy cross to bear of sorts.
Right.
And they work together to do it.
Right. And, you know, as Dr. Franco, I believe, said in the interview that I did, that they have to do it in phases because it is so heavy. And it's just a wonderful tradition, and literally it goes back to the 5th century.
Right, yeah, 12 days of it, and there's a capo for each section of lifting.
That's right.
So that's good. I'll check it out. Brooklyn is full of all these cool things.
I know, isn't it? And we discover something new just about every day.
The multicultural festival, as you put it. All right. Well, that is all for this edition of Currents. On tomorrow's show, Pierre Toussaint. He is a former New Yorker who's being considered for sainthood. We'll follow his footsteps, and we have all that and much more tomorrow on Currents.
And remember, you can always watch us online. netny.net/currents is our website. And we'd also like to hear from you. If you have a story idea, maybe you just want to let us know what you think of the show, send us an email at dropusaline@currentsny.net.
Well, thanks so much for watching this edition of Currents. I'm Francesca Maxime.
And I'm Matt McClure. Have a great night.